Hello, and welcome back to Beyond the Plot podcast. I'm extremely excited to welcome another amazing author guest, Georgia Harper. In today's episode, I sit down with Georgia and talk about all things Dove, her latest book that was released yesterday, the 31st of March. In today's episode, we step into Georgia's inspiration into becoming an author, the epiphany that she had that took her on that journey, the adventure that she took to capture and write Dove. We talk about her challenges, her inspirations, and how excited she is for this extremely amazing novel to be placed in today's world. So sit back and listen to Georgia Harper's story. Hi, Georgia. How are you?
Hey, Lisa, I'm so well, thank you.
Good. So thank you so much for joining the podcast today. Very excited to have you here. I've just finished Dove. So yeah, extremely excited to hear the story behind the inspiration.
Yeah, I'm so excited to share it. This is actually my first piece of media before the book. So you are the very first person I've ever talked to
Ah.
publicly about the book, which is exciting. So every
And
question you ask me is
it's
going to be a
very
new question.
brilliant. Love that. So before we get into it, share with the listeners a little bit about yourself.
Sure. So I live on the Sunshine Coast in Queensland. I'm a fairly new author, as in I'm new to fiction writing. I started my first book in 2020, and that came out with Penguin in 2024. And then Dove is my second book, but I've had no fiction writing experience prior to my first book coming out. And so my career's mostly been in psychology, and I just had a bit of a interesting experience where I kind of heard a voice telling me one day to write a book. And there was sort of a whole sequence of events around it. And I just sat down and wrote. So it's been a new and exciting world for me.
Amazing. So
Yeah.
let's talk about that for a moment then,
Mhm.
because you said that it kind of something came to you to kind of kickstart that. Had you done any writing before, or was that the moment that you just thought, "Hey, this is my
Yeah.
time. This is what I need to do right now"?
Yes. So when I was a little kid, I loved writing, and sort of my school, actually, both my primary and high school asked if they could hold on to some of my short stories. And I started, before I studied psychology, I started in journalism with the intention of writing. But everyone laughs when they hear this. I was so socially anxious. I couldn't chase down a story. And I was like, I can't do this. And I left. And I guess I always maintained that desire, but I literally never wrote a word of fiction as an adult. And then one day in 2020, it was the pandemic, and I had been living outside of Brisbane, where I'm originally from. And I really quickly decided to go back to Brisbane. And I had previously worked for a long time in prisons and forensic mental health. And I made a rapid decision to go back and work in a prison environment again. And I went back in, I put my uniform on, I looked at the list of sort of prisoners' names, and there was a lot of guys that I used to work with. And I just had this really strong sense that that part of my life was over and I needed to leave. But everything was so uncertain with the pandemic, and I was like, I'm a little prone to impulsive decision making. I was like, Georgia, do not quit your job on the first day. And so I just walked around the dark in the streets of Brisbane. I still had a house out in the country that I was renting, and I was anyway, I walked around and I was having this conversation with myself about quitting. And I was walking down this street that had a lot of significance to me, and I never really thought about that until later. But I stopped at this point and I had this kind of voice, like almost outside of myself. And it said, like, this voice is loud for a reason. Listen to it, follow it. It will lead you good places. Be brave. And I was like, and I wrote it down, immediately emailed in my resignation that night. And then I woke up to the same sort of voice, and it was, you've always wanted to write a book before you die. Get up and start now. And so I literally did. But it was so bizarre. Like within a few weeks, I was back out sort of in a rural area. I was back at work. But every day I get up at like 4 o'clock in the morning, drive an hour to work in the dark, write on my laptop. And the story just came to me really fast. But I never did anything, like I never Googled, how do you write a book? Or I just wrote and I wrote. I never met a
Mhm.
writer. I didn't do anything. I just wrote for a year and then I edited for a year. And then I remembered from the movies that people have literary agents. I'm like, I think I need a literary agent. So I Googled Literary Agents Australia, and Curtis Brown, which is the world's biggest literary agency, comes up. And I looked at their submission dates. I didn't know it was called like the slush pile then, but I looked at their date
Yes.
and I felt like I chose the one that felt right and I chose the time that felt right. And I'm so not this person, but I did that. Put it on the pile, and you get the kind of message that's like, we take a tiny handful of people every year, like, you're probably not going to hear from us. But they said, if you are going to, it'll typically be within 2 to 6 weeks. And in my lunch break at work 2 weeks later, I got an email from Curtis Brown, from the person who was to become my agent, which was Benjamin Paz. And yeah, he was literally the first person to ever read the book or know what it was about. So no other living
Wow.
human. And when I met with Curtis Brown, they're like, "So how many people have edited it?" I'm like, "No, no, you're the first person to read it." And I don't think they believed me. Anyway, it turned out that Benjamin Paz was also Benjamin Stevenson, who do you know Benjamin Stevenson? He's a crime author. He wrote Everyone on This Train.
Oh,
Everyone on
yes.
my anyway, doesn't matter. He's written a bunch of stuff. But I had stopped reading fiction while I was writing, and it was really strange because a friend of mine had lent me a book, and I was reading it as Benjamin was reading mine, and I was reading his book, his current book, as he
That's
was reading
such
my
funny.
manuscript. Yeah, so everything just lined up. Curtis Brown signed me, and then within weeks it went out for bids, and then a week before the bids were due to close, Benjamin said, "Meredith Kerno from Penguin Random House wants to meet with you." I was like, "Okay," and I like Google who Meredith is, and I'm like, "Ooh, she's good." And I met with her, and then Penguin just came in on the final day of bids and acquired the book. And so it was like a total whirlwind for me.
Amazing.
I knew nothing. I met my first ever author weeks before my book came out in 2024. So, like, almost, yeah, about 2 years ago right now. I went to my
Yeah.
first writers' festival 3 or 4 weeks before my book came out. So I literally knew nothing about the industry. It's been a wild ride since. I've learnt a lot.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh, but you know
Yeah.
what? I keep hearing this. Like I've chatted to a few authors recently around like how did your journey start? And it's like someone said something to me or I had an epiphany
Yeah.
or like it was
Yeah.
just like in that moment and they listened to their intuition and it's almost like the path that they were meant to be on. Um,
Yes.
but at this time, and yeah, it's equated to them being really successful. So I love that story. I think that's
Yeah.
such a fantastic
It's such a
story.
magical story. I know, I love it too. And
Yeah.
yeah, so it was amazing, but I was not well prepared in the way that, writers who try for a really long time, they're quite resilient and
Yes.
robust and they know what they're getting themselves into, whereas I knew nothing. So
Yeah.
yeah. But yeah, it's a
Yeah.
great story.
That's amazing. So it took you what about a year to write the story. So when you had that moment
Mhm,
of you want to write a book
mhm,
before you die,
mhm.
did you have the story in your head or where did that inspiration come from?
I had the idea, I never thought I was gonna write a book about it, but there was a concept that I kind of had a conversation many years before with a prisoner, and it just made me really think. Something he said to me, he'd done some very, very terrible things twice, and he was back in prison, he was never going anywhere again, and something he said to me during the course of our conversation just made me think, like, honestly, if your victim's family knew that you were in here saying that, thinking that, what would they think? And that sort of, I started having this conversation with myself where I'm very evidence based. Like, there's a lot of great evidence around intervention for offenders, and, most prisoners will come back to the community. And I also strongly personally do not believe in capital punishment or the death penalty. But in that moment and after that, I started asking myself that awful question of like, if somebody did something to somebody that you really love and you were given the option of like revenge or just what you thought was justice, what would you do? And that's where the book's called, What I Would Do to You. And it is a question around, victims and victim survivors and families, and if they were given the choice, what would they do as justice or punishment or revenge? So that's
Yeah.
the sort of was never an idea for a book, but that thought would be in my mind. And
Yeah.
then, yeah, no, it just came to me really fast and almost like very well formed. And I never thought, oh, should I write a different book? Or I didn't question it. I just sat and just like I felt like I was channeling it a little bit, and I almost felt like it was
Yeah.
something that was done already, and I just needed to take the steps to get
Yeah.
to it. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
Mm.
Would you say, are you more of a, like when you did it then, are you with your second book as well, Dove, are you more of a plotter or panster? Like how does your
Oh,
writing kind of
look, I for the first one, I did very like I had a lot of the stuff that I wrote. I think I didn't. Yeah, I did. What I would say is minimal plotting. Minimal plotting, minimal
Yeah.
research. I scrawled a few notes here and there. I would kind of think ahead a little bit, but I let things come to me. With Dove, oh, I found it so hard. I didn't realize. So for what I actually did between What I Would Do to You and Dove was because I wrote What I Would Do to You without talking to anybody else, right? And then Benjamin, who's no longer my agent because he's authoring full time, but at the time we
Yeah.
talked, and I was kind of like, he's like, just write what you feel, but you can run stuff past me. And my publisher's like, you can run stuff past me. And I'm like, yeah, yeah, thanks, I've got this. I didn't know that you had to, well, you have to, but I didn't realize that people kind of like write in the same genre. Like, so I just went and wrote this like dark piece of literary fiction, which I still really love, as like really mental health heavy. It's got nothing to do with crime. And then I turn up with my manuscript and
Yeah.
my new agent, and they're like, what are you doing here? I'm like, well, I don't, and they're like, and then I'm like, do I need to keep writing crime now? Because I don't really think of my first, like What I Would Do to You. It's about a crime, but I don't think of it as
Yeah.
crime. And you can also, I think, see that in Dove. It's not super
Yes.
pacey,
It
and it's
doesn't
not
it
like a who
yeah.
done it so much. Well, it's yeah. And I think
Yes.
my desire to write really comes more from the bigger issues and the bigger, like big moral questions and perspectives and contemporary issues.
Yeah.
Having said that, so then what I realized is publishing houses want you to pitch them ideas. And to pitch an idea, you need to have it kind of formed. And so with Dove, like I did, but it did take the joy out of it a little bit for me in terms of like it being a mystery to me about what's going to unfold. So
Yes.
again, it wasn't
Yeah.
heavily like from chapter to chapter. I just had the vaguest idea of where I was going, but I sort of didn't sit down with detailed notes or anything like that. You know, yeah, yeah. So yes, I had a rough idea of where I
Yeah.
was going. Yeah, and then yeah,
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
because it's I mean, it's such a intense story, and I mean, but so when you got your agent, and then when you obviously were picked up by Penguin, when you went to write your second book,
Mhm.
did they automatically offer you a two-book deal? Is that what it looked like, or did they offer you one book deal and then you went out to submission again for the second book?
No, so it's really interesting. Why I had good conversations with my agent initially, and we actually decided to do a one book deal. And there's kind of pros and cons of both. And the sort of, I guess, the pro of doing a one book deal that I had never really thought about that, but we discussed is that if your book does really like when you first publish a book, no one really knows how it's going to do.
Mhm.
And if you do a two-book deal, you might kind of lock yourself into something. And if your book actually really takes off and does really well, you're potentially writing a second book that you've already locked yourself into that you might not have. I think for me, because I need to kind of want that burning passion around it. And it might not kind of reflect how well your first book has done. So we just had this sort of like pragmatic discussion about whether I wanted to go down the track of a two-book deal or not. But so with my second book, look, Penguin has been amazing in terms of sort of being, yeah, like vocal in their support for me, like helping build my writing career. So I felt somewhat comfortable. I knew that they had an interest in reading. my next works, and I sold Dove to them on a synopsis and a sample. Um, yeah, so yeah, that's how that worked.
Brilliant. Yeah, and it must be so nice to have stayed with them because
Yeah.
they're going to start knowing you as a person. They're going to recognize
Yeah.
your brand and your
Yeah.
writing style as well.
Yeah, well, unfortunately for them, I think they just realized that I'm more of a pain in the ass than they realized in the beginning. Sorry. I think I think they get more of my quirks over time, and they're probably like, "Oh my
Yes.
god," yeah.
Yeah.
But no,
Oh, but
they're
that's all
great.
part of it. Like no, yeah, no writer is the same, right? I think
No,
that's what makes this industry so special because even just looking at your background, just yeah, again, talking to so many different authors who some have worked in journalism, some have been corporate lawyers, some, it just I think that all creates like their writing style and the stories that inspire them. And I think, yeah, it's really nice to see that as well. And what I'm loving at the moment is the message out there because I think previously, and I've said this before, some people look at becoming an author that they have to go to university and they have to study creative writing or something to do around that
yeah,
kind of
yeah,
industry. And that's the way forward. Well, actually, I think if you've got it in you to write a story and you can inspire people, like who's
mm.
stopping you from,
Yeah,
you
no
know,
one, and I
being
never
a
realized
writer,
that
becoming
before.
an author?
Yeah, yeah, and you know
Yeah,
why I did
yeah.
it like that? The underlying thing, I think, was if I had looked around and I understood how the industry worked and the level of competition,
Hmm.
I just would have been crushed by that before I even began, I think. And I think it was
Yeah,
just that, like,
yes.
I'm going to do my own thing and be in my own kind of bubble. And it's quite interesting because I still feel that way. I try not to expose myself to, it's not really a conscious thing, but I don't look at a lot of, okay, a lot of it's attention span related. Like, I don't watch movies. I've probably not seen a movie in like 15 years. I haven't watched like a TV series, for years. Like, every now and then I'll watch a little bit. I read, but my
Yeah.
attention span is not great, so I'll often listen to stuff. Um, although
Hmm.
I do use a lot of like scrolling stuff. But so I sometimes feel like I'm quite isolated from concepts and content that's happening in some ways.
Hmm.
And I don't hate that. And I interestingly, somebody told me recently that JP Pomare, he's got a podcast
Hmm.
called He Read. She Read.
Yes.
Yeah. And they said he talked about Dove. And when I listened to it, I really loved one of the things that he said. It meant a lot because he said he could tell when he read my book that my voice was different or that I wasn't trying to adhere to the writing styles of other authors. Like, I wasn't trying to emulate. And I was thinking, yeah, that's because I'm kind of not paying attention. And I know there's a lot of like, you should do that. And I probably should. And I would probably learn a lot, but I feel like it will contaminate I don't know. Like, I feel like I don't, yeah, I don't know. I
I
just
get. Oh, I
like to
get you.
be,
I no,
yeah.
I do get you. Yeah, but it's refreshing because when I read your book, um, I like I said to you, I haven't had like I love reading thrillers, psychological thrillers. I love reading romance. Like I kind of like I read a lot of different genres, but your book actually really captivated me in an emotional way because I think
Mhm.
just your writing and how you were able to portray the characters in the book and you really felt that I literally felt like I was in that book with them and I was so
Aw.
invested and
Oh, I love
and like
that.
Dove being the main character. Yeah, and I just felt like Dove being the main character, like I just was on her side the whole time, you're just like, all these things have happened to her. She's her own voice. She's staying true to herself, like,
Yeah.
and you can see that she's such a strong, independent woman.
Mm.
And there's certain situations that, are around her, but she always straight to kind of stay true to herself.
Yeah.
And that's what I loved. And I thought, yeah, you could really feel the different characters, different emotions going on there. And let's talk about Dove because
Yeah.
I shared a view around, all starts with this message that she puts on a wall, right? And
Mm,
I was
mm.
saying to you how when I was reading the book and those messages, one, I thought, how did you come up with these messages? Because
Mm,
they're so relevant. And I thought
yeah.
any woman that is reading this book
Yeah.
this would really resonate with them. So
Mm.
let's talk about that. Like, what did that stem from? How did this story get created for
Yeah.
you?
So I've got another story behind the story. So when I was writing What I Would Do to
Okay.
You, sorry, not when I was writing it, when I was editing it for it was in edits for Penguin. I think it was like 2022, 23. And I was during that time I was living alone on a rural property, but it was a property that it had a big front fence with access to a main road, right? But during that time, while I was editing What I Would Do to You, which has a lot of like, I was editing stuff around a character called Hannah, who she's 18. She has lost her little sister to a horrible murder, and she also has experienced some violence herself at the hands of men. And she had a lot of anger and a lot of stuff. And I was editing her stuff. And around that time, a man that I did not know very well at all did something that it wasn't something I could report. And it wasn't something, it really unsettled me a lot. And I was really upset about it. And I was also like, in the moment when it happened, I froze and I was, even though I understand that that's kind of like, and I placated him a little bit. And even though I know that's like a good survival response in some circumstances, I was mad at myself for doing that also. And I shouldn't be because it actually was quite effective in that situation. But I had a lot of feelings about it. And leading right up to that happening, I had been, while I was doing these edits on the Hannah character, I had been down this rabbit hole on social media where it was a good few years earlier, but it was still an active thread where someone had posted a question which was asking people what they do if there were no men for a day. And I was just reading, it went like the responses went viral. So there were like thousands and maybe millions of responses. And I was reading them, and a lot of them were from women, and the themes were so consistent. And it just spoke to this desire for a feeling of safety and freedom to be able to do things that we often want to do, but that we, maybe sometimes even don't realize that we're putting limits on our abilities to do because of fear of either being harmed physically or of judgment or ridicule or whatever. And so I had that in my mind, and this incident happened with this man, and and you'll see this played out in the book. I walked past my own fence and I'm like, I was so mad. I'm like, you know what I'm going to do? I'm going to write that question in bloody big letters on my front fence, which is the question is, what would you do if there were no men for a day? And I'm going to do an art installation. I'm going to invite women to come and paint their answers, like passers-by can stop. And I told friends and they're like, "Georgia, no." And I'm like, "Why?" And then they told me why no, and I was like, that made me even more angry to think that I wouldn't be allowed, but I couldn't write something like that without it presenting more of a safety risk, right? And I was like, but I'm like, I was dissuaded by them. And also once I calmed down. So I didn't do it. But I kept it in my mind because I was like, one day I'd love to do some sort of art installation or whatever. Anyway, time went on. I wrote my second book that got, I've put to one side for now, my literary fiction book. And then I needed this new idea quite quickly. And I was like, and I had the essence of Dove was already with me. But the wall question came to me, and I'm like, I know, Dove can do it. That's totally something Dove would do. And so that's how that came about. But I deliberately set it, the storyline is set in the 1990s on a little permaculture property.
Yes.
And I was already living on the Sunshine Coast. I'm the author ambassador for the Sunny Coast Hinterland Writers Festival. So I'm up in the hinterland a lot. So I decided to set it there, but I set it back in time to kind of ask the reader the question like, where are we? Where were we then? And what has actually changed for us in those 30 odd years? Yeah. Mm.
Yeah. And I said this to you, didn't I? I was like, it felt so like current
Yeah.
that it's quite scary to think that not a lot has changed.
Yeah. In
When
so
you when
many
you
ways,
think about
right?
some of the things that would yeah.
Yeah.
Um but what I found really interesting is obviously the different perspectives as well, because obviously in the book it does bring in the male perspective of
Yeah.
how they feel about that question
Mm,
being written on the
mm,
wall.
mm, mm.
And I think that meant a lot as well because, not giving too much away,
Huh.
it goes down the route, first of all, it's like what you expect. But then
Yeah.
actually it's quite refreshing how some of the mentality and I think we'd get that a lot in today's world.
But yes, look,
Yeah.
I don't at all like while the question is confronting, it is not a book that is intended to be disparaging towards men, and I hope that that comes across as well in the sense that
Mm.
men are in their own prison a lot of the time, and they are, and when I say men, I'm not, I'm making some generalizations that are not general. I think there are
Mhm.
some men who have no interest in, changing their beliefs, but there are men who don't have a great awareness or have been raised in a particular way, who might perpetuate certain things. And for me, it's really just more like I would love men to read that book, and I don't know that I will get many to read it. I'm glad that JP Pomare read it, and he also recommended it for men. And it's just more, I think, trying to have that conversation. Um, but yeah, it's such a tricky one. I've got so many thoughts. I don't know where to start.
Yeah, I think like everyone will probably read it and take their own
Yeah.
kind of take their own approach to kind of how
Mhm.
they digest it and
Mm.
the what they think of the book. But like you said, I think you've done it really well. There's an even balance where,
Yeah.
you've put it in perspective of women and men. But I think men should read it because it might give them a little bit more insight
Yeah.
how women think. And
Yeah. Yeah.
it might make them a little bit more conscious. And there's plenty of men in the world that are like 100% they
Yeah.
support women. I don't think that's
Yeah.
ever going to change. There's always going to
No,
be, a bit of that dynamic there.
I think so. Yeah.
Um, so question about the characters, like how did you come up with like Dove and Noah and Bella? Because they're the three main characters in the
Mm,
book. So
mm,
how did
mm.
you come up with those characters and did they come to you straight away or did it take a little bit of time to create them?
Um, Dove was already with me. I didn't create her. She was just like with me. I think in a way,
Yes.
um, Dove for me is that sense of the woman that we all want to be in terms of self acceptance, in terms of like, this is how I am, and I won't allow anybody to, I am so sure in myself that I don't allow others to kind of mess with my identity. I have, and I accept myself because I think she's a character who has flaws, knows she has flaws, but accepts herself despite them. And I just, yeah, and also just that sense of, yeah, she was just inside me already, I think. And then with Noah and Bella, I don't know. No, they came to me as I was writing them. I again didn't do any sort of planning around their characters at all, other than their relationship with each other, and they just came to me as I was writing them, really. So I didn't sort of sit down and map them out as characters. I think I wanted for Noah, a man who was the sort of quote unquote sort of good bloke and just had some typical sort of family struggles and life difficulties and stressors, and found himself in a place in life that he didn't really ever plan to be and didn't really want to be, and felt quite trapped. And then Bella, as a 15-year-old going through some typical stuff around like living in a small town, growing up, but also she has some questions around, her own identity. And yeah, so yeah, they more came through me as I wrote. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, amazing. And did you always plan to have like that, because obviously daughter, father, did that come to you quite instantly, or did you kind of
Oh,
have to think about that dynamic there of like who you were going to cast as kind of the main characters?
no, I don't think so. I'm trying to recall. I don't think so. I if I did, it wasn't in a very structured way. No, I don't know. Yeah.
Yeah.
Hmm. It's
Well, I
interesting
like
to
the
be asked those
dynamic. I
questions.
think
I
you've
don't
got
really know.
perspectives. But it's good to have that dynamic. I think the different perspectives, right? Because you've got, a female adult, you've got a family man, then you've got, a younger
Yeah.
um, female, but also a daughter, right? So it kind of incorporates, a few different
Yeah.
perspectives and,
Yeah.
um,
And
mm,
Bella's chapters are by diary entry. So there's some benefits to that and also some
yes,
restrictions around writing her that way. But I enjoyed doing those. But I did have to try
yes.
and be conscious about trying to make their voices different, in terms of for the
Mhm.
reader. I mean, they were different in my head, but just in terms of my writing style. And I think that's something that will continue to be something that I'll focus on because that's not something that I had, really been that conscious of before. So I hope I
Yeah.
achieved it to some extent.
So
Yeah.
before we jump
Mhm.
off, do you want to give a brief kind of synopsis of Dove? So for those
Mm.
listeners out there considering going and supporting you and buying your book, let's get them intrigued because I'm 100%
Sure.
bought in and I'm going to
Sure.
sell it to
Thank you.
everybody. But
Thank you.
you do your
So
author thing.
Dove is set in a small country town in the 1990s. She lives on a very pretty little property, and she basically grows flowers and veggies, and has that cute country life. There's an event that happens, much as I described, that she gets quite upset and writes his question on her wall. There's a bakery next to her house. Women, pass it, tourists come through, and women start to write their answers. As that is happening, there's also a story of a unsolved missing persons case. So a teenage girl who's gone missing from the town many years before. That sort of comes into the spotlight a bit more, and the men get their feathers ruffled by Dove's Wall and what the women in town, so their wives and girlfriends are writing, and daughters are writing things on the wall, and they're sort of renoing the town bowls club, and they all get together and they kind of chat about why are women writing these things about us, and they're taking it a little bit personally, but there's some change there and questions there for them throughout the book as well. But there is some sort of increasing, the Dove has increasing concerns for her safety. So things start going awry on her farm. She starts becoming quite worried. She also has a secret romance going on. So she has, you know, a visitor to her property, and they have quite a intense and complicated relationship, but it's perhaps more complicated than she realizes. Uh,
Well, look, I have absolutely loved chatting to you, Georgia. I could honestly keep talking to you. There's so many more questions that I have. So, yeah, I'm excited to share your story and for everyone to hear it. And I think what an amazing start to your author career. That's gonna, I think that's something that you can tell people forever.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me, Lisa, and also for
Anytime.
being the first person I get to talk to about this. It's really exciting. Some of these questions I
Oh.
literally have not even thought about before, so that was fantastic. Thank you.
You're welcome.